Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to CVI at a Crossroads, Promising Progress, New Threats, and Collaborative Solutions. My name is Dallas Wright, Assistant Director of Communications at the Center for Neighborhood Engaged Research and Science, CORNERS. And as a born Chicagoan whose work has revolved around violence prevention and community safety for the last decade, I'm really excited and honored to be moderating today's webinar. I'd like to thank as well our incredible co-sponsors at Giffords Center for Violence Intervention, a longstanding champion for transformative community safety efforts across the nation. And of course, I'd like to thank each and every one of you, the attendees, for taking the time to be here with us today and for your own commitments to this critical work. Your presence today is a testament to the shared urgency that we all feel to protect, strengthen, and sustain community violence intervention during this pivotal moment for the field. Our field has evolved and grown, enjoyed wins and overcome setbacks for decades. It's not new work. And today we find ourselves at a crossroads. The political and fiscal landscape is increasingly uncertain, putting the entire CVI ecosystem under greater scrutiny and strain. The Office of Gun Violence Prevention in Washington has been shuttered. ARPA funding that's been so instrumental in expanding CVI initiatives across the country is sunsetting. Critical federal data sets and funding sources that researchers and others rely to help guide interventions are vanishing, threatening the infrastructure that allows us to measure and refine what really works. And so without concerted action by stakeholders like you and I and our panelists, years of progress could be eroded. And so that's why today's conversation is so important. In this 90-minute webinar, we'll highlight how CVI practitioners, researchers, and policymakers are navigating these challenges, and what steps we can ensure to take that CVI remains a cornerstone of U.S. public safety moving forward. I'm excited to introduce today's esteemed panel of experts. They combine decades of experience across different disciplines, yet they're united by their pursuit of a safer, more vibrant community life for all people. We have a lot to discuss, so I look forward to the conversation, and let's get started. And so I would love, again, to introduce our speakers. You'll see on the screen we have, and I'm just going in the order that I have on my screen. First, we have Dr. Andrew Papachristos, the faculty director at Corners and also the director at Northwestern's Institute for Policy Research. We have Yolanda Fields, the executive director at Breakthrough Urban Ministries in Chicago. We have Fernando Rejon, executive director of Urban Peace Institute in Los Angeles. And we have Dr. Jordan Costa, senior project manager at Giffords Center for Violence Intervention. Thank you all for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I want to open up with a question for the group, and just to kind of get us going, right? And I'd like to start out with, as I kind of mentioned, right, this field is not new, right? CVI, violence prevention, violence intervention has faced challenges before in decades and years past. But this is a unique moment, and so I would like to hear from each one of you all. What makes this moment unique? What do you all feel like is at stake right now for the field? And I'll start with Fernando, please.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting us here. I mean, I think the field's in a very we're in a moment that we've never been before. I think there's a lot of energy. There's some funding, and of course, there's federal funding threats. But particularly in LA and across the country, I think we've had more funding for CVI than we've ever had in years past. I think the time right now is to really build the identity of CVI and our autonomy, how we differentiate ourselves from other movements, but then also continue to partner with movements such as the gun violence prevention movement. Where we're at now is that we are working really hard to have folks that are most impacted by violence really lead and shape the movement, and have folks' voices represented at the highest levels to ensure that as we build the future of CVI and the movement, that it is reflective of the realities on the ground. It is reflective of those who are most impacted, and that have the knowledge base and the skills in order to address violence at the ground level. And we also have the opportunity to expand the understanding of public safety beyond just the traditional understanding of public safety through the enforcement of laws. We can expand public safety to include these non-punitive approaches that are community-led. And so when people come, for example, when people come to LA for the Olympics in 2028, we don't want them to just think about the sheriffs and LAPD when they think about public safety. We want them to think about the 300 peacemakers that are on the ground that are ensuring people from all over the world have an opportunity to be safe in our communities, and that also that the communities that are represented have access to the resources that events like that will bring. So it's an exciting time, and it doesn't come without challenges. But when you've been in this work for a while, the challenges are constant. It never changes. So we're always struggling, we're always pushing, and we're never going to get there. All we can do is pass the torch. And so overall, it's an exciting time.
Absolutely. Uh, Dr. Costa, I'll go to you next.
Similarly to Fernando, to me, violence intervention work has always been about adaptation. As someone who has done direct service work, who's directly worked to help people recover physically and mentally from penetrative wounds, to now being a community-based researcher and policy advocate, I can say with confidence that regardless of which lane you've chosen to serve this movement, and even as funders and government agencies, a big part of the work is being ready and able to face challenges head on and persevere. And we all feel the impacts of community violence when it proliferates in our communities. And if we're to continue advocating for community, then we also have to embody what that means in practice. So like Fernando said, this work was valuable before there were millions of dollars attached to it. There's a rich history of peacemakers who never get credit or who've never sought credit for their part in the civilian-led public safety infrastructure we're talking about today. So before I answer your question about what I think is at stake, I want to properly acknowledge the staff at organizations like the Urban East Peace Institute and Breakthrough to remind us of who does the real work to drive down violence, who really deserves the credit, and to whom we all have a responsibility to advocate for through whatever platforms we have, with accuracy and with intent and also with humility. So that said, we obviously can't ignore the fact that we're in a very different place now than we were just 5 years ago. 5 years ago, we didn't even have the term community violence intervention, and now we have a field that's professionalizing, in part due to the passage of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act and other legislation and local efforts that are solidifying a commitment to the field. So for those who don't know, one of the ways our team has tracked those changes over time is through the creation of the CVI Path tool, the Policy Analysis and Tracking Hub, that we update monthly to show you CVI bills across 7 categories that have been introduced all the way through being passed or even failing, so we can see what language is working, what's not working, how different jurisdictions are going about incorporating CVI into their public safety ecosystem. And so based on our 2024 legislative year in review, we saw that 13 states and Washington, D.C. appropriated over $520 million to support CVI through legislation, which is a dramatic increase from only 6 years ago when only 5 states had appropriated a cumulative $70 million for the work. And so when I think about the moment we're in right now and what's at stake, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say everything we've worked for and the livelihoods of the people doing the work and also our legitimacy as a field, we've collectively worked to bring attention to not just the utility of CVI work, but the necessity for CVI workers in communities most impacted. We've begun to build an infrastructure for a field and a line of work that's finally getting recognition it deserves. And we're not on solid enough ground for that to not be legitimately threatened if we don't remain focused and committed in the way that those on the front lines have remained focused and committed with or without federal or state support. So if this is truly a strategy we believe works, then I would say now is the time to prove that we can persevere and preserve the resources we have so that we can support the livelihoods of the people who got us here. CVI is not just some feel-good effort. And so to me, this moment will tell us whether or not those who advocate for public safety will embrace the strategy as part of that or find an opportunity to dismiss it.
Thank you so much. Dr. Papachristos.
Yeah, I just want to add my +1 to my colleagues that already went ahead. And I'm going to pick up where Jordan left off. I actually think, of the many things that are at stake that everyone already mentioned, there are 2 that are fundamental to the future of the field, but also just neighborhood safety in general. And one is this architecture, this sort of public safety architecture or ecosystem or structure. We use a lot of different phrases. And the other is actually the building of a neighborhood workforce. Because one of the things that's happened over these last 5 to 8 years has been building out things that have been inherent in neighborhoods and communities forever, right? I'm a sociologist, so we talk about things like informal social control or collective efficacy, but at its heart, most public safety doesn't happen around formal law enforcement. It happens between neighbors and families and friends, things that get stopped before they happen. And part of what this field has been doing for decades, but especially most recently, as Jordan was saying, it's really amplified and geared up, and they start to really bring in best practices, is building out architecture, right? Building out different types of interventions, hospital-based interventions, trauma-informed interventions, mediations, non-aggression agreements, education, cognitive behavioral interventions, and putting it together, literally like we build cities, with this invisible system that is built within the relationships among the field. And actually what we've seen happen is sharing and information. I mean, this was a field that 10 years ago, organizations wouldn't share information with each other. Now they're at conferences together. Now they're bolstering each other. And actually the field as a whole is developing. It's not perfect. No field is perfect. It's still building and relatively new. But this is an important part when we think about how cities deal with public safety. It actually expands toolkits beyond what's possible. And one of the things that's really vital when we understand this work, we know in all of the cities that I work, but our work in Chicago continually shows that outreach teams and community-based work can actually reach the people that are at highest risk of being shot without a formal legal contact or a legal touch. The possibilities are huge, right? And again, we're still working on that. So that's the one thing. And the second part I mentioned, which when we think about what's going on in the world today, numbers of people losing their jobs, this is a workforce that's being built, right? This is, in many cases, for the first time, first salaried positions where you are training people, you're investing in social capital, in human capital to do this work, often at great costs on people's own health and well-being. But why are people doing it? Because they care and love their city. So we've spent these last years really building up these two things, and in some ways trying to improve and move forward and share information. And if all of a sudden, say, the funding continues to get pulled back, everyone's going to kind of lose jobs again. And we're going to go back to this cycle of hiring people, laying people off. Knowledge is going to be, set back in very real, tangible ways where we're going to lose momentum, we're going to lose steam, so that next time this idea comes around, and it does come around every decade or so in a new form, we're going to be starting all over again. And I think that loss is huge. It's huge for the field. It's huge for the lives people are saving. It's huge for the workforce. And all of those things matter when you're trying to do something like improve public safety.
Yes. And Yolanda, you want to take us home?
Sure. I'll just quickly add, and it really isn't for me all of the things that we've named, because they all are super important and they help us to accomplish the end goal. But when I think about what is at stake in my neighborhood, it's lives. Lives are at stake. And for us to lose ground right now would mean that we don't have an opportunity to show up in the ways that we have, whether we're talking about workforce development and providing skills and opportunities for people who need it the most, whether we are talking about our returning citizens to our community, or the grandma or grandpa that sit on the front porch looking for safety. All of those things are at risk if we begin to pull back on all of the gains that we've seen.
No, tremendous points. No, thank you all. I want to stay with you, Yolanda, actually, and we're going to transition to a new set of questions that we've tailored a little bit, given you all's really incredible expertise, right? And so, staying with you, Yolanda, right, with your work at Breakthrough over the years, you all right now, your organization reaches about 20,000 people annually, right, through different services and activities, and granted, right, intervening in violent conflicts, walking and kind of spreading through communities, right? Interrupting violence is really emblematic of CVI work, and it's essential to the work, but there's so much more beyond that, right? And so I was hoping if you could kind of touch on in more detail some of the other, perhaps less recognized ways that CVI workers impact their communities.
Yeah, at Breakthrough, we really believe that the key to a thriving community is feelings of safety and preserved life. And so for us, it's this comprehensive approach. It's a means of giving people the access that they need: access to housing, access to employment, safe spaces for their children to play, opportunities for our neighbors to meet and to just hang out in an environment that is conducive to building community. And so our work is really focused not just in what has typically been considered over these last 10 years community violence intervention, but it is also housing. It is youth and education development. It's health and wellness. It's community economic development. And then it is creating these spaces where people can be well. CVI for us is more than just street level intervention. And when it is framed that way, I think we really miss out on the opportunity to understand the rich value that community violence interventionists bring to their communities. When I think about the interruption of violence and the primary role of, those who have boots on the ground, I can't help but think about COVID and how COVID was an opportunity, I think, for everyone in our community to see them in a very different light. They were credible messengers who really pivoted. They pivoted from, intervening in violence to actually doing things that continue to keep people alive in different ways. Whether we're talking about passing out PPE, right? The words that we don't even use anymore, but literally saved lives, to food and other essential things that help to keep our community alive. And so, because they understand the needs of our community and can respond in real time, I think that makes the difference. And any other field that we can talk about, I think when we talk about this field, the just very flexible ways that our workforce can show up matters in this life-saving mission that we all have.
No, absolutely. COVID was a really a trying time, but also a shining moment in a lot of ways for the field. I have saw some incredible things during that time. Like you said, the agility and the ability for CVI workers to really meet the needs of the community in real time was powerful. I want to shift to Fernando really quick now, and so you kind of touched on this in your opening words, but when we talk about the field and how it's continuing to grow and expand and professionalize in so many key ways, um, can you talk about? It's really a two-part question. What sorts of training opportunities and development opportunities currently exist? And secondly, what do we still need? What's still needed for the field really to kind of grow and reach its fullest potential?
Well, I mean, training opportunities are important. I think ongoing education and training to continue to professionalize the field. I mean, just like folks have to get recertified, doctors have to go through certification, lawyers, etc. Intervention, needs that same infrastructure, especially as the landscape changes around violence and how it manifests over the years. Like what we're doing in 2010 is different than what we're doing in 2025. The impacts of social media, et cetera, we're dealing with some of that in LA right now. So how think we need to make sure that the training is reflective of the realities of how violence is manifesting at the ground. And I think continuously training intervention workers and ensuring that there's certification, ensuring that intervention workers are part of the faculty that are really leading it. For us, when we built out the Peace Academy in LA, we had to make sure that it was practitioner led, because if it wasn't reflective of the streets and reflective of the realities that intervention workers are facing, then it wasn't necessarily going to be as effective. We bring in other professionals as well, but it's about 80% led by practitioners and 20% by other professionals from other fields to contribute to it. But also, that's also part of an organizing platform. Not only do you train, but you build cohesion amongst the group in order to build a power base to advocate for dollars and advocate for political social space to do this work. I think that's a key a lot of times that folks overlook, is that has to be continuous. The Metropolitan Peace Academy in Chicago, beautiful building, doing great work out there. The Peace Academy in DC. I think Oakland and the Bay Area is looking to build out an academy as well. And so having these educational / training centers for the workforce that Andrew was talking about, you have these centers that the workforce can come to get training, to get wellness services for self-care, which is a big need. there's multiple things that folks need to be trained on, but then also there has to be different levels of training as people develop in their careers, as a street outreach worker, then a lead, say a manager, and kind of moving into other areas of work, right? Helping with mental health responses, etc. So creating career pathways for intervention workers is another piece that is essential, but more of what's needed as well as the capacity building to administer dollars. So as we're advocating and we're getting dollars at the federal level, all the way down from state, county, city, and even philanthropy stepping in, is that how are these dollars administrated? And then the organizations that are closest to the ground a lot of times don't have a lot of that infrastructure. How do you support and build up those organizations in order to administer the dollars? A lot of times the people that advocate for the funds do not directly benefit from them. So we need intermediaries that are going to be able to position themselves to, one, they understand the mission of what CVI is, what the core is, and then what is on the periphery of the ecosystem as you go out from the core. For us, the core is non-punitive approaches, and it has to be the violence interruption, that you're directly engaging those in the middle of the cycle of violence. Is the core to CVI. If we don't focus on frontline workers and that core violence, we're not focusing on that core of CVI. Everything else can wrap around and support, and you need that infrastructure and that ecosystem to be developed. But an understanding of what CVI is, what it isn't, an understanding of what are the lines with law enforcement or areas that need to be discussed. And really it comes down to, at a national level, and we're looking at pulling together people in June to have a conversation about this, about the CVI identity and what that is, to start pushing the narrative forward. As we are going to have to advocate in a different way, we're going to have to create a public narrative in a different way. We also have to sit down and really talk about this work, what the firewalls are, what it is and what it isn't. And I think the opportunities for continued development of organizations, development of groups, and creating leadership opportunities for folks who have been frontline workers, who have that skill set, is going to be important. That's what's really going to sustain our movement. What I'm looking for, I'm always looking for, people that are leaders that want to step up, because not everybody wants to step up into that door, because there's a lot of challenges, responsibility that comes with it. But when folks step up and step in, you start to see the movement and the conversation change. Having like Paul Carrillo at Giffords, having Melvin at the grid office is important for us, right? Having Juan Carter step up at Giffords, right? And having people who come from the field and say, look, now we want to push this field forward because we want to represent this work at a higher level and ensure we open up space for others to do the same that we've done. For me, that's important. That's a lot of what this work is about. So that's an opportunity that we do not want to miss, and we want to ensure that we support that at all levels.
Powerful point, that what you ended on. Yeah, absolutely. Having folks with real experience in the field at the highest levels of leadership pushing the work forward. Absolutely. I'm going to come to you, Andrew. And we talked about how this ecosystem currently is so, and really always has been, so multidisciplinary and so interdisciplinary. I would love to hear from you how you're seeing and envisioning the role of the research community moving forward, particularly like what are some really essential areas of inquiry that have to be explored?
Yeah. Thanks, Dallas. When we put this panel together, we knew that the field was at a crossroads, but actually, if you look at what's going on in the newspapers today, and especially these last couple of weeks, this sort of attack on universities, on science, on research is horrible for America. It will set us back in innovation and development in cultural domains. Universities are not perfect institutions, but actually the fact that now we're seeing research and science in jeopardy in ways we haven't since McCarthyism is massive. When we come to this space, the impact will be even greater, because it's only been, these last several years, you've seen some tremendous strides in innovative research, innovative methods, innovative findings, and we're just scratching the surface. And I'm going to answer your question, Dallas, because we're missing a lot is the answer. And what I fear is that it's going to get abandoned kind of altogether. So to answer your question, and by the way, Dr. Costa should jump in, as a researcher in this space, or any, my other panelists. But one thing that is really key, there's a policy perspective about impact, right? How do we figure out what works, what doesn't work. And to summarize, the field of research in the space, that's the answer. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Turns out that's true of any social or economic or educational intervention. But we actually can't tell you as researchers yet is when it works, why it works, when it doesn't work, and why it doesn't work, right? We haven't even gotten to that space in large part because we're missing some of the base from the science perspective, some really basic fundamental science, right? We can't tell you in some cities how many participants there are. We can't tell you different styles necessarily of interventions or outreach, or Yolanda's earlier point, the different elements of the intervention. So in some way, even to answer this impact question, the does it work question, we have to do better. And I'll come back to that in a second, because it is something that Fernando just said that we have to get to. But the does it work question is a smaller question if we can't, as researchers, understand what the work is, right? If we as researchers can't document some of the things that Fernando just said, we're actually not doing our jobs, right? Because all too often what happens in this space is people are looking for this takeaway on impact, but they're not being able to assess who are you actually reaching? What are you actually doing? So even in a city like Chicago with 3 million people, if you've got 300 outreach workers and 900 crews, they're still barely scratching the surface. So to know where and when you're actually doing something is vital, right? So this idea of impact is great, but if we can't figure out what you're doing and we can't understand it, and you can't do that without trust, right? Again, universities have not perfect institutions, but they have to earn trust in fields to build research that's fair, research that's transparent, research that is engaged, that can help answer those sorts of questions. And, Yolanda gave a great example in Chicago. Dallas, you led this effort in Chicago, of course, like what happened during COVID? We had outreach workers giving out PPEs. They were taking kids' homework from school. They were dropping off, hard copy packets because they didn't have internet hookup. They were delivering food, and all of that is about safety. Which comes to the third thing with this field really needs to understand, and I'll kind of avoid nerd level talk. But ultimately, if community violence intervention is about community, then we have to move beyond just individual behaviors, and we have to move away from just aggregate levels of violence. It's actually somewhere in between. So when an outreach worker is doing their job, they're not just working with, say, Dallas, but they might be working with Dallas and Andy and Jordan all at the same time. But Dallas might be the only one who counts, right? Because you're the participant. But in fact, you're kind of working within this network, and we rarely capture that as well, right? And so I think those are the really big, important elements, right? Science and the researchers in this moment are at a place where we're starting to be able to move that. Our Views study in Chicago, in collaboration with our partners at SUNY Albany, right, built with our partners a survey of outreach workers in Chicago, in New York, in Boston, analyzing it together, using it not just to inform research, but to help guide practice with questions that outreach wanted asked. HVIPs are the same kind of possibilities, right? And so we're at this moment again where we're just starting to answer these questions, and that's going to be at risk. And it's not just the policy question, it actually informs practice, right? Because my experience has been outreach teams, CVI teams, they actually have lots of questions and they want them answered. And they want them answered in a way where they're not afraid that the answer is going to shut off the lights, right? But will actually help them improve practice. I have yet to meet a partner that doesn't want to improve, that doesn't want to do better, that doesn't want to help more. And there's a role, right, for research in that space. And I think that's, I wouldn't do this work if I didn't believe that, essentially. So I hope I answered your question. Oh, one last thing, innovation, sorry, right? The other fear of being at a crossroads is not just that you backslide, is that you stop innovating, right? And in 2006, I wrote a paper that said, gangs in Chicago would never use the internet. Turns out I was totally wrong. Want to know why? Because nobody could afford Amazon at the time. There was no, T1 line in certain neighborhoods. And now but if we miss it, the technological aspects or what other innovations are going to happen, then we're going to be even further behind. So we not only have to kind of keep up, we have to be on the forefront of helping people innovate in practice and in research.
Yeah, no, all really important points. I think that idea of trust that you mentioned really stuck out to me. one, trusting each other within the field across disciplines and across kind of backgrounds and experiences, but then also trusting ourselves as a field to be able to make these cases and be able to continue to demonstrate impact and innovate despite the challenges. So really important points. Thank you. I'm going to come to Jordan as we kind of come to the end of this section. And Jordan, you really said it at an interesting intersection, right? You kind of, in your introduction, talked about you have on the ground experience, direct service experience, and right, research experience, policy, all these different kind of spheres of the work. And so for you, I'd like to ask, right, we know that CVI works. We know that there's impact. We see it on the ground. We see it in the numbers. But how do we bridge and this sort of a gap maybe between what we are, as insiders experiencing on the ground level? How do we bridge the gap between that and then sort of that policymaking process? How do we make that case more strongly moving forward?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question because, like you said, both from the data and from what practitioners see every single day, we know that CVI can work. And we all heard what's been shared so far, that lives are being saved, conflicts are being de-escalated, communities are being strengthened. And so I don't really think the challenge is proving impact, although there are challenges in research terms that Dr. Papachristos laid out for us right now. But for the purpose of bridging the on the ground to policy gap, I think it's more about making sure that impact translates into real long-term policy and investment. And a few things come to mind when I think about how to bridge that gap. First, we have to recognize that policymakers and practitioners often speak different languages. On the ground, success looks like a young person choosing not to pick up a gun, or being the person a young kid calls when they're contemplating hurting themselves or someone else, or even facilitating a breakthrough moment when an individual realizes that the trauma that they've been exposed to is not a universal experience, and walking with them on that healing journey. But policymakers are oftentimes looking for numbers: how much crime is reduced, how much money is saved, what's the return on investment. And so if we're going to get real sustained investment, we have to package these stories into language that moves budgets. And that can be done by doing things like pairing data with narratives, because the numbers matter, but I've seen that it's really the human stories that make those numbers impossible to ignore. Another thing I think about is we have to shift who's in the room when these policies are made. Too often, decisions about violence intervention are made without the people who do this work every day, and that has to change. Practitioners need to be at the table, not just as people who implement policies that are decided for them, but as people who shape them. And that requires investment, not just in program funding, but like Fernando mentioned, in building the advocacy capacity of organizations doing this work. Because when policymakers hear directly from credible messengers or from outreach workers or from survivors, I feel like the conversation shifts from should we fund CVI to how do we fund it for the long haul. And one really compelling way I believe that can be done is through coalition building. That's where real people power comes from. Multiple members on our team at Giffords, including myself, are tapped into statewide coalitions, either as facilitators or members. And we've been a part of securing some really historic wins, like in California with the AB 28 ammo tax that funds CVI. We're in New Jersey, where our group mobilized after Najee Seabrooks was killed by police to get a bill passed for community crisis response teams. And I think this approach is key because collective advocacy creates pressure that individual organizations can't achieve alone. And so when a broad coalition speaks with a unified voice, it becomes much harder for policymakers to ignore them. And it's this kind of coordination doesn't just get policies passed, but it also helps ensure that they're implemented with the resources and accountability needed to make them successful. And finally, I just want to mention that we have to break the cycle of short-term funding. We've seen it in too many cases where money comes in after a crisis, but then when attention shifts, so does the funding. And that can't keep happening. We have to treat CVI like emergency response, like education, like any other essential service. And that means securing permanent funding streams, pushing for dedicated budget lines at the city, state, and federal level, and making it clear that investing in CVI isn't just a temporary experiment, but it's a proven a necessary part of public safety. And I think that's the real challenge at this moment. Right now, we're seeing a return to tough on crime rhetoric, and we know where that road leads. It leads to over-policing, it leads to mass incarceration and failed policies that don't actually stop violence. And we know that communities are safest when they have the tools, resources, and relationships to prevent violence before it happens. And that's what CVI strengthens. And so if we want to secure the future of the work, we have to keep connected with one another, whether that's through coalitions or referral networks. And we need to keep amplifying the evidence in versatile ways. And we need to keep making the case that CVI is an indispensable part of a public safety ecosystem. And so I don't think the question is whether we can bridge the gap between policy and practice. I think it's more about whether we're willing to do what it takes to win the investment that the work deserves.
No, 100%, 100%. Your kind of 3 points there there's so much synergy between them. There, it was really had a lot of thoughts kind of percolating. In particular, just the power of coalitions to demonstrate, right, that we're here for the long haul, right? We're not lifting up one organization, one voice. Like, no, this is something that's a movement, truly a movement, and that's a whole different kind of conversation when you come to policy and funding. So I'm going to shift now to our next set of questions, and I'm going to ask these questions to you all in pairs, right? So we have our first pair will be Yolanda and Fernando, and then second will be Jordan and Andrew, right? And so coming to Yolanda and Fernando, and you all can answer them in whatever order, bounce off of each other. I'm just going to put the question out there, right? The field's growth, right? We talk about funding. The current growth it's been supported really amazingly by both private and public dollars, right? And kind of in concert. And so I'm curious for you all in your work, how have you all tended to those sorts of relationships with funders, especially during these more recently kind of turbulent and chaotic times? How have you all helped them understand the value of CVI work?
Happy to go first. I think it's important to just continue to build off what Dr. Costa just said in terms of coalition building and collective impact. Even when I am thinking about the ways that we are able to engage funders and legislators, we are most successful when we do that as a coalition. And so in Chicago, we're talking about communities partnering for peace. It is, those of us who are willing, to go to legislators, to invite them to us. And I think in my own personal experience, what I am finding is that it is not just, in Illinois headed to Springfield. It is how do we keep them a part of the conversation at every level? And so, whenever there are opportunities, and I will tell you, I love it when our research partner creates those kind of opportunities for us, like we recently got from Corners. I'm able to take those reports and say, hey, I've got good news. I have things that I want to share, things that you need to understand better that are happening. And here's why it's happening. And so I think being able to, one, go as a coalition, that proves our collective impact, but it is also having some research, some evidence-based information that we can share that helps us to really kind of boost the idea of CVI actually working, right? We could see it when we are in the work, we hear it on the ground, but until we have something in hand that says a credible institution has done some kind of evaluation. And I think those are the things that we found that funders respond to well with our narratives, right? They love to hear participant stories. They love to hear from those who are on the ground doing the work. But all of that has to be coupled with the evidence.
Fernando,
No,
go ahead.
that's right on right there. That it's part of that game, right? It's the evidence. It's the scaling of services. Like, so for example, in LA, we're administering about over $9 million to frontline organizations that are part of the LA Violence Intervention Coalition, which is a coalition of 20 frontline Black and Brown led organizations in LA that have a powerful voice. It is a power base in LA for this work that can talk to decision makers, talk to funders, and say, this is what we need, this is why we need it. Now, how groups are funded, there's some groups that are small organizations that have, mom and pop shops, but can do amazing work on the ground and don't necessarily have a lot of that capacity. Then there's some that are intermediate, and there's some that are plug and play. And so you have to make sure that dollars get to all of those groups. There's an equity focus, right? It's easier to give dollars to organizations that are plug and play because they already have the administrative capacity. Sometimes some of those organizations maybe aren't as connected to the ground, right? And so that's some of the critique from the ones that are closest to the ground, right? And so ensuring an equity model of ensuring that there's capacity building support for the smaller organizations that are building their capacity, that's important. And then the medium groups, ones that are in the middle, they're able to build theirs as well, and you kind of see what those needs are. And then the ones that are larger plug and play, it's really about focusing on innovation and scaling and how can you actually do more. So, in talking to funders and engaging is at the public level, it's advocacy. We just had a press conference with over 150 peacemakers in front of City Hall with the mayor, the president of council, and other council members there talking about this works, this needs to be funded, this is part of public safety, that CVI is essential to public safety, right? Hearing that from city leaders is important. But when you have 150 brown and black men and women behind you that do the work righteously every day, it's an easier argument. Building relationships with funders is important as well. There's a lot of education that goes with that. It's a relationship, and I think funders want to know that. Bottom line is that, can you deliver? If we're going to give you 100,000, 50,000 to 200,000, what are you going to be able to do with that? What is the scale that you're going to be able to deliver at? And that's important. Getting up into the millions of dollars, are you a high impact organization? What are your relationships with the community? How are you working to build the field? And so it's based on, the different levels of where organizations are in their development, are going to help determine kind of the scale of dollars that are received. But I've seen organizations grow tremendously because they've kind of listened to feedback and they worked on the capacity building and they built infrastructure to where, they have, staff that can cover a lot of ground, and that come from the community, that come from those communities that have, that are credible messengers in those areas. So the funding piece, the advocacy never stops. But once you advocate and they say, for example, CalVIP, hey, there's $75 million to administer throughout the state. It doesn't stop there, because you have to make sure that there's the capacity, that people are applying for it. You have to make sure that they're able to utilize those dollars effectively. So there's a lot more to it. The advocacy win is an advocacy win, but making sure that it's implemented and that the dollars hit the ground. They hit the ground where it's intended to hit, right? The most impacted communities, working with the highest need individuals in each of those areas. So the conversations about, funding is at the federal level. We know what the challenges are with these federal freezes and them looking at the DOJ. I think we have to rely more on the state levels. We have to look at our counties and cities and put pressure on them. And then philanthropy needs to step up at the national levels and local levels. They are not going to sustain what federal government provides for funding, but they can help focus on the innovation and the specific capacity building needed in order to continue to sustain this work. Right now, the work is under threat because of all the federal funding could potentially be taken away. On the other side of that is that we have to have power bases, not only at the local level, but at a national level, to begin generating this narrative to advocate for the work. But then we have to have the people that can implement the work on the ground. And so this is, when we talk about an ecosystem, it is a true ecosystem. What is the interrelationship between the researcher, the frontline worker, the policy advocates, the funders, the researchers, the advocates like Eddie that we have at DOJ that are supporting this work? Ensuring that those relationships are strong, that there is a fluid communication and a fluid understanding of the direction that we are going, what the mission is, what CVI is, what it's not, and how do we support this movement during this time where we're transitioning. We've transitioned into this new administration. I think we can survive it. I think we have to continue to push. I think we have to continue to get stronger. And I think we have more resilience now than we've ever had, but it's not easy. And so our work is cut out for us, but being able to support each other and having leaders from our community step up, and step in a little bit more into that light to say, this is what we need and this is why, this is who I am, this is what have I experienced, this is what we do. I think we could transform what safety is in this country.
No, absolutely. The ecosystem point really stuck out for both of you all. Right. There's organizations of different sizes and scopes and specialties. Within those organizations, there's staff of different specialties and experiences, but each of those individuals and each of those organizations, each has a role to play, each has a case to make, right, as the field continues to grow. Absolutely. I'm going to pivot now to Jordan and Andrew. And my question for you both, and again, feel free to bounce off of each other and go first, go second, whoever wants to go. My question for you all is, given how the CVI ecosystem and the work on the ground has evolved and continues to thrive, how should the research community also evolve to continue to remain relevant and impactful?
Yeah, I can start. I think if research is going to evolve alongside CVI in a way that actually matters, we have to stop letting incomplete surface level measurements define the legitimacy of this work. Andy and I are very aligned on the idea that asking, does CVI work, without interrogating how we're defining success, what counts as evidence, and whose knowledge is being prioritized, is the wrong question, because it fundamentally reduces complex, relational, and deeply embedded community work to a binary of effective or not, when the reality is far more nuanced than that. So right now we're trying to fit CVI into research structures that weren't built to capture what actually makes it effective. This was the focus of our newest report, Opportunities for Innovation. It was also partly the focus of my dissertation. So because if we rely solely on crime data, we reinforce a law enforcement-centered definition of safety. And if we only track short-term outcomes, we ignore the longer processes of relationship building and trust and behavioral change that determine whether interventions actually stick. And if we don't examine the day-to-day realities of implementation, we miss the structural and systemic barriers that impact whether programs can even operate as designed. The work doesn't happen in a vacuum, and so research shouldn't be treating it like it does. That's why qualitative data and narratives aren't just important, but they're essential to how we build evidence. I'm very blessed to be a part of the Black and Brown Collective for Community Solutions on Gun Violence, which is full of qualitative researchers who are dedicated to this specific cause, because the stories of interventionists, survivors, and community members aren't just anecdotes to support quantitative findings. That's real data. They tell us not just what happened, but why it happened, under what conditions did it happen, and through what mechanisms is change sustained. And it provides insight into the gaps in current frameworks, like what's missing from how we measure and what's being overlooked in how we study, and what actually drives transformation at both, like Andy mentioned earlier, the individual and community level. So it's also not just about collecting these narratives, it's about structuring research so that lived experience is treated as expertise. The people doing this work every day hold knowledge that's critical to refining CVI strategies, but they're too often positioned as subjects rather than co-creators of knowledge. And so for me, if research is going to remain relevant, it has to shift power. Practitioners need to be shaping research questions, guiding analysis, determining what findings matter for policy and funding decisions. Otherwise, we'll continue producing research that's disconnected from the actual realities of CVI, and policymakers will continue making decisions based on an incomplete understanding of the work. So when we talk about how research should evolve, it's not just about what we can do to prove effectiveness, it's also about rethinking how we build knowledge in the first place. And if we don't challenge the limitations of existing research models, we're not just slowing down progress, but we're actually actively contributing to the conditions that keep CVI underfunded, undervalued, and misunderstood. And so the goal for me isn't just better data, it's better ways of knowing to ensure those who are making decisions about the utility of CVI programs have accurate data to refer to, because bad research leads to bad policy. So if we don't take control of how CVI's impact is measured, then we'll keep fighting for resources in a system that refuses to see the full picture of what real safety can be.
So, I mean, all I can really say to what Dr. Kosa just said was amen, on something very particular. There's two things I want to talk about. One is really this idea of, why we started Corners in the first place, which is what Jordan just said, right? Which is, where do the real questions come from, and what can science do, right? Science is not everything, but not everything is science. So even when we talk about narratives, like Jordan was just saying, how do we boost and amplify those, but also how do we as researchers follow those patterns in a particular way? What do we hear over and over and over again, right? Even in some of the comments, we continue to hear about the health and safety and well-being of a workforce, which we've taken for granted in the policy perspective, not the organizations. The organizations know, right? But how do we make sure that that gets boosted and amplified in spaces that needs to be heard from, and also heard from particular folks that are outside, right? It is for better or worse, researchers' role here is often one as an intermediary in between funders and government officials and policy folks that are calling us, that are looking for things. And if what we do is fall back on the types of pre-canned answers that Dr. Costa was just talking about, they're going to get the same things. Well, crime went up this way or crime went up that way. How sure are you? So researchers actually need to be in deep partnership, from the questions we ask to how we go about asking those questions and what can we learn. And I just want to, Yolanda in Chicago, we work side by side every week with your team, bringing data to a table, reviewing it, not because I like data, I do, but actually because it's providing your outreach workers something. And to just give a very concrete example, outreach workers, I know I'm preaching to a lot of the choir here, they know everything that happens in their neighborhood or their 5 or 6 blocks. They can tell you so-and-so about Andy's, ex-girlfriend's, roommates, brother, sister's, cousin, and they can trace those things, but you go 4 blocks away and the knowledge drops off, right? And if it's something that's coming from a place that they don't know, how do you get there? It turns out a little bit of data can help. And that's what we're seeing with Yolanda's team, with Chicago Cred, with the Institute for Nonviolence, with a bunch of our partners, is bringing a little bit of data that we use to do our job right to the front line can make all the difference in the world. It can save lives. It can help you reach people. Why? Because there's a massive digital divide in this field, right? Because you're using resources to pay staff and you don't have the capacity in-house necessarily to do something. But that comes from partnership. You're only able to do that in partnerships. And it spills over into building side-by-side wellness programs, right? I'm not that type of doctor, but we're helping folks use data to boost sort of staff well-being. And then I can go back to funders or policymakers and we can kind of highlight those things. So really, I just want to, support everything Jordan said, that you can do rigorous research in this way. And my saying not everything is research, that's okay too, by the way, right? It's okay for something to not, that's as it should be, right? So what spots can we boost and amplify and help and interrogate? But there is a problem, which if you ask a question, you have to be ready for an answer too, which is not always easy. The second thing I want to say, and is we actually, to which goes for the innovation, we need a big nerd fight in this world. Now, in your head, I say nerd fight, and you see people with pocket protectors, flailing all over each other. But actually, the way researchers and scientists talk about things matters. So if I get up in front of somebody and I'm not respecting your work and I'm not presenting it correctly, it matters. If I'm using words that I know are dishonest, it matters. And so researchers also we need funding, we got to do this, we got to do that. We use language when we shouldn't, right? We say things like, we throw words like gold standard out when we know that most of research in society has never been conducted, say, with a randomized controlled trial. Right? Copernicus never did a randomized control trial. It turns out there was a lot of important findings. Air travel, seat belts, lead in water, none of those things were done with any gold standard research. They were done with shoe leather, observation, very fundamental science. And so researchers that are saying things that they know are not true, it's a problem. Just like saying that qualitative research cannot be rigorous, right? This idea of rigor, that's a problem. It absolutely can be if it's done a particular way. And I think, again, one of the things that I try to do is have that in that space. And so everything Jordan said, I want to just fundamentally do it. And again, Yolanda, I'm always appreciative of you and your team when we come there every week. That's the type of work I think we need to move in, which doesn't mean we don't need other things. But in this particular space, given the sort of mistrust that has been between all sorts of institutions, if it doesn't start there and we're not honest with those conversations, we're going to be shut out, and it's not going to help anybody.
No, thank you both. No, it's definitely, there are many really fundamental and unproductive assumptions that researchers who are engaged in this type of work need to confront moving forward in a coalition, right? To kind of go back to Jordan, what you mentioned earlier. There's in the same sorts of ways that we've seen practitioners be successful reframing narratives around what community safety looks like and who really is at the key of solutions in that space. So if there's no other comments, I'm gonna go to our closing question, and then we'll get into Q&A from the audience in a little bit. For my final question, again, this is to the group. So, and maybe we can start with Yolanda here. But my final question for you all is, we've talked kind of in general about innovation, right? Give some examples here and there, and the need for innovation. But I'd love to hear, as we close out, from each of you all, what in your eyes is the most important, most critical innovation that you see coming in the field, right? And how do we take that from a plan, an idea, and bring that into fruition? And Yolanda, I'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a hard one. I'll just maybe spitball a couple things that we've talked about today. I think one of the things on the ground that I am extremely excited about and looking to see more of is just this collaborative approach to how we all do our work. We know that every community is nuanced, but I think that the more people we have working in CVI, the more opportunities we have to make our community safe. And so I am excited about this idea of being able to figure out how to actually do that together and be effective in it. I think the second thing for me is I'm just applauding every time Dr. Costa spoke. I was like, yes, thank you, Jesus. And the same with Andy. It's this idea that, especially in the Black community, right, we've been very hesitant around research, and we all know many of the reasons why. But to understand that there is a disconnect in the language that is used. And there has also been, for a very long time, this dismissal of qualitative research. And so I think that is going to be innovative. And if we can move, more in that direction, that it, benefits the field. And then lastly, I would say this idea of our men and women on the ground learning these professional skills and being developed and seeing that as a workforce is probably one of the most innovative things that we can do. And we've got to do everything necessary to ensure that it is a group of our workforce that doesn't get neglected, doesn't get forgotten, and that as we move forward in the field, that we continue to lift that up in itself as workforce.
No, thank you. I'll pass it to Andy next. Go ahead.
So Yolanda kind of took my answer, but I'm going to pick up on her second. And also, I don't know if it's the most important thing in Dallas. I know you kind of use that broadly. I actually think an important thing for the field to consider broadly is actually the further development and extension of the workforce, right? So in many places right now, you have like outreach worker supervisor, right? And there's so many other ways the talents and work can be used, especially given how taxing it is on the workforce itself. So when we think about the health and well-being, it's not simply like patch you up so you can go back out again. It's also understanding where you're going to develop as a career, as a profession. If you're choosing to give your life to your community, to this space, to public safety, what are other key ways that you can develop? Maybe you want to be a researcher. You should be, right? Jordan mentioned the Black and Brown Collective. Part of what that's trying to do is develop more junior researchers in this space, right? Maybe you want to go start your own business. Maybe you want to go into a different field of service. The field needs to be able to do that with its current workforce, because otherwise it's going to be harmful to them, and that's not fair, right? That's also extractive in a very fundamental level. At the same time, we should be thinking about an on-ramp into the field. In Chicago, there's the Peacekeepers program. There are other programs. Like, how do you develop talent, right? How do you bring people onto this space in a way that is also healthy, right? What does it mean to work a caseload or work with the participant? How do you do these things? So there's this opportunity, which we'll lose, right, without consistent funding, of how you take care of the people you have over the long term, right? Or how you bring people into a new space. And that's one of these things that is about building. I kept using the word architecture, infrastructure. They should endure, and to do that, you have to kind of build out as well. You don't just want to use people and then kind of they move on to something else. You want to help a field. That's at risk, but I also think there's so much room for innovation. And this does go back to what works and doesn't work, or what's helpful or not helpful. We have to understand all these things. Maybe other people have talents to be life coaches. I actually think there's a lot of promise there, but we don't really know a lot about it or how to build it off. And again, in part because so many organizations are just worried about staying in operation and having to, essentially to do that sort of work.
Jordan?
Yeah, my answer was very similar to Andy and Yolanda, so no pressure, Fernando, but say something different. For me, I think the most important innovation in this field is fully recognizing CVI workers as essential public safety professionals and making sure that recognition isn't just symbolic. Right now, people praise interventionists for their sacrifice and they call them heroes and they highlight their impact. But when it comes time to fund the work, they're left with low wages, no benefits, no job security. Obviously, some places are better than others. But those were some of our findings from our On the Front Lines report that spanned 4 major cities where CVI has roots. And that's not recognition, that's exploitation. CVI is a 24/7 job. These workers are responding to crises at all hours, stepping into dangerous situations, preventing violence before it happens. But too many are also working multiple jobs just to survive because the one job that demands everything from them doesn't pay enough to sustain them. There's no hazard pay, there's no overtime, there's no pensions. And if funding runs out, there's no guarantee that they'll even have a job next year. So how can we expect the field to grow if we don't also help create the conditions for people to stay in it? So if we're serious about CVI being a core part of public safety, we need policy changes that reflect that. Cities and states have to establish permanent budget lines for CVI, just like policing and emergency response. And this work needs hazard pay and retirement benefits. And like Fernando mentioned earlier, real career pathways. So interventionists aren't grappling with the weight of the work alone or forced to leave the work out of financial necessity or burnout. And I would also add that funders with the resources to do so have an opportunity to help improve these conditions by using flexible dollars to test innovations that the public sector can pick up. But if we don't see some kind of shift, we'll keep losing experienced professionals and we'll keep hearing the same excuses about why CVI isn't a stable solution. But instability, to me, is a funding choice. It's not necessarily a reflection of the work itself. So if we want CVI to scale and if we want it to really last, then we have to stop treating it like a passion project and taking advantage of people's passion-driven motives and start treating it like an essential life-saving profession, which it is. So that's something I'm committed to turning from idea to action. One of the ways our team is actively moving on that idea is through our 3rd annual Community Violence Intervention Conference, which is coming up on June 16th and 17th in Los Angeles. That space is made to honor the sacrifices of frontline workers and convenes over 900 practitioners, survivors, researchers, policy makers, and advocates to address some of the gaps we've all laid out today. So if that's something anyone on this call wants to be a part of, registration just opened this week, actually. And I think we can get a link dropped in the chat if you'd like to join us.
Yeah, no, definitely looking forward to the conference. And the chat's going crazy. Really, really important points, tremendous points. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass to Fernando.
Yeah, so thank you I agree with everything that was laid out. I guess the thing to add, and this is an innovation, I think I just want to recognize the evolution of this field, where it's come from, not only within research and policy and even with workers on the ground. It's changed tremendously from when, I started, 17 years ago, on who was leading this work at the national level, who was talking about it, how we talk about it, how research is conducted, how groups are partnering. And so I want to just recognize the leadership of folks that have stepped up, that come from the field, that are really shaping this movement and opening doors for a lot more people to step in. So for me, that's not necessarily innovation, that's evolution, but it's also just a nod to the direction that it's going, because before it was really 2 big models that were pushing this forward. And now that's really changed, diversified, and cities and communities have really dug in to reshape and redefine what that means for them and how they do their work. And the other thing I'm excited about, because we really haven't had this capacity for a long time, but is the evaluation and research I think that we're doing. Um, we have a Dr. Josh Gregory on our team who built out CVI Empowered, and we'll learn more about it soon. But we're also working with Dr. Shawnee Buggs at UC Davis, and then Dr. Papakristos, Northwestern, and Dr. Soledad McGrath are helping us and supporting us building out this evaluation for the organizations that we're funding. But one of the exciting things is that it's a different type of research that is working with community. But on the other side of it, the databases that we are building out that are community-led, community-driven, and that communities will have access to demonstrate the effectiveness of their work, I think are extremely important in understanding how violence manifests in different ways. I think the ability to demonstrate proof of their work, because we know anecdotally, like Jordan said, we know anecdotally, we know the stories, and it helps. And I think it helps with funders understanding the anecdotal stories, but understanding the reality of what violence is on the streets, but from an evaluation perspective, where you can really demonstrate that we put CVI resources here, violence went down, and you can track that and demonstrate it. I think that's an innovation that's going to help solidify the field and make it even more credible, because even law enforcement can't necessarily do that and say, "Hey, look, we did this went down, this went up." They're not evaluated and held to the same standard that intervention is held to, even though they have billions of dollars invested there. Intervention has not even a portion of that, maybe even not even 1% of that. But the standard for us is a lot higher, and the fact that we're able to demonstrate, hey, look, this works, and this is why we have the data to prove that, pushes the conversation forward and really strengthens our work and strengthens our community. So that's one of the innovations that I'm excited about. I'm really looking at continuing to develop in partnership with these other cities, like Chicago, that are just doing this amazing work. We're just trying to build stuff in LA, but everything's in partnership. It's synergistic. A mom crying in Chicago is the same as a mom crying in Oakland, as a mom crying in LA, and Baltimore, etc. So we want to make sure that we do this work right. We do this work respectfully. We partner with people. We give credit where credit is due, and we just recognize the leaders that are stepping up and doing the work day to day to ensure that one is, bottom line, we're saving lives, but also that this work is recognized and funded so that we can scale and transform what public safety is in this country.
No, thank you for that. I was really really vibing with the point that you made about opening up the accessibility to data, right? That transparency when it comes to data, right? These are folks in the community are seeing interventionists on the street. They know them, right? They're seeing they're encountering them in day-to-day life. And so it's very powerful then to be able to also make the data available for those same community members to be able to see the impact for themselves and be able to understand how the organization is functioning. So thank you all. We have a nice chunk of time, about 20 minutes for Q&A. And thank you all in the audience who put some really insightful questions in the chat. Please continue to do so. I'm going to try my best to get to as many as possible in the time that we have. I'm going to start with the question for Yolanda and Fernando. It's something there's like 3 questions about it, so I want to make sure we get to it. And it is, in a nutshell, right, how do we better address the wellness needs of frontline staff in particular, right? What are some best practices you all have seen or even implemented yourselves, and what's still needed to really make sure that folks are taken care of and able to thrive?
Yeah, just some quick ones for me. I think it's already been mentioned. One is it is being able to see our frontline workers as essential. I think the value that we place on them will also drive our priority to ensure that they are well. And so then that second piece is prioritizing, prioritizing their wellness and their health. If that means, having dedicated therapists who are available, if it means understanding what people need to be well, and then doing that right. So we don't just, in our organization, we don't assume that there is a one size that fits all. And so we're asking the questions about what is needed. Maybe it's just time out, just a break, right? A couple hours to step away. So I think it's getting very curious about what the needs are and not assuming that we already have the answers.
That's an extremely important point, Yolanda. It's different for everyone. Some people will say, "Hey, look, I'll sit down and talk to a counselor, or therapist, and want that support and may need it." I think that has to be available, but there's other ways to do it. Sometimes just sitting down and breaking bread with someone that you can confide in and talk to. A couple Saturdays ago, we had this intervention event for all of intervention in LA. Had over like 300 people there, and everyone just barbecued, and we had music, and there was awards, and we had seen people we hadn't seen in years. But it was healing. But it was also reaffirming that you're kind of building the spirit, bringing the spirit back to the field. And that's for me, for myself personally, that was healing. That was something that was like, wow, just to see people that have mentored me, schooled me on a lot of things throughout my time. Um, UPI, we're talking about even just having these. We're going to start just opening up our office every once a month, every Wednesday. Just have brunch. Anyone that can come in and break bread. It's not a meeting. Not going to have an agenda. Just come in and hang out, right? Talk about things. Let's see what how we can support one another. I think that self-care, it's really, the onus is, you have to, as a leader of an organization, you have to make it available, but you have to listen and understand what people really need. That's one. The other side of it is on the individual. The individual has to recognize it and make time in order to do it. One of our colleagues, Taco, took his a group of intervention workers from South LA out to an island, Catalina Island, and he's like, "How you feeling? What you doing?" He's like, "No phones, right? You can't use your phones." They're like, "I'm bored." He's like, "Good. You gotta get that boredom down, right? Sometimes you gotta let your shoulders down a little bit, right? Take a breath of fresh air, put yourself in a different environment, in order to begin kind of breathing, at a different rate. Exercise is important, all of that. And so some of it's education, some of it's nutrition. Some people do indigenous practices, some people it's Christianity, religion. Everyone has their way. So, making sure that that what people's needs are recognized and that there is support for it.
No, 100%. It's what I'm hearing is really, it's how do we really nurture and cultivate like a culture of healing and of wellness. It's not just an activity that's done, but it's part of the work. It becomes ingrained in the work itself. Um, a really good question actually that came in that's directly related, and if it's okay with you all, I'll stay with you too with this question here. Um, you know, Given how much interventionists give of themselves, right? And CVI work is mission-driven work. But at the same time, and Jordan, you touched on this, it almost creates a dynamic where you feel like you're on the clock 24/7. You're just on call, right? The work is your life. And so I'm curious, Fernando and Yolanda, what sort of conversations, or how have you all maybe helped some of the frontline folks navigate those boundaries and kind of figure out how to kind of do the work without it becoming consuming?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I wish I had a great answer for it. I think, what happens when you live and work in community, which I also do, it's very hard to step away, right? Like I see people in the grocery store, I see them at the post office. It's always with you. And so what I try to say, to my team and particularly to my leader is that unless we are well, we are not able to do good things. And so sometimes it's forcing vacation, where I'll just say, I don't expect to see you today. In fact, if I see you, you're going to have to leave. I don't know where you're going, but you won't be able to stay here. And so there's this way that I think we have to care well for one another. And and it is what I love so much about CVI. People are dedicated. I haven't seen this kind of dedication in any other area. And so people will continue to work and continue to be available. And so unless we help people to establish some kind of boundary, we know that this could also lead to burnout. And so that's me. And encouraging people to take time off, encouraging them to set boundaries, and encouraging them to understand their own triggers, and then to create plans to help themselves when they are triggered.
I mean, it's challenging. I mean, there's committed, very committed folks. I think what I found, especially with intervention workers, been doing it for a long time. It's a long grind. Deal with a lot of stuff, a lot of trauma. Um, access to better pay. Access to better pay um, really gives folks some financial flexibility to take a break, to take a vacation, to travel somewhere. Um, that's important, so that people have the opportunities. Um, because if you have to, for example, if intervention workers are, have to work multiple jobs just to just to keep their head above water, to feed their families, help their kids with school, that's another stressor, right? Aside from the work that you're doing constantly. But if you have some level of financial stability, it helps change the dynamics. And I think the support is, I remember we tried to force somebody to take vacation, but it just didn't work. They run their own program. But again, you encourage, or sometimes when I know there's individuals that are burnt out or on the verge of burning out, I say, hey, brother, let's sit down, let's have some lunch. Meet me here, let's go. And we just sit down and we just talk, even though maybe it just slows them down a little bit. It just slows them down a little bit because it's chaos sometimes. So that's all I have.
Yeah, no, I hear you. It's I think working in the field for so long, at least I'll speak for myself, it it becomes normalized, the amount of dedication and commitment that folks have. But I'm hearing you all talking. I'm like, man, what an incredible workforce. Should you have to demand that they don't come to work? It's a really amazing thing. Um, I'll open this up to the larger group now, because there's also a couple of questions about this, and there's a clear connection, right? Given the importance of wellness, someone also mentioned the importance and the need of kind of like back of house, like admin, ops staffing as well, right? Yeah. What are some best practices, or how do you secure funding for that, right? How do we really make that clear that it's not something that's a side part of the work, but it's essential to funders?
I'm just going to jump on two things there. The funding question, when you ask that part, Dallas, that's a trickier one. That's a narrative issue, and I think all of us had mentioned this, but it's making, again, it sounds so basic, but making people value and care about the work and the workforce is about narrative change. It's about changing what people are seeing that own those spaces, right, or have the purse strings, if you will. And now we have the addition of what the federal government is not going to be doing anymore of, let alone kind of philanthropy that can't replace public dollars, right? If public safety is a public good, ultimately public investments have to be a part of it. But I want to go back to just one quick thing that Fernando had mentioned, and which we've been seeing again and again, is actually one way to do that is to document the extent to which outreach teams are doing exactly what you said, right? To going from the narratives that we have and then putting additional work behind it. So our Views study, again, in Chicago, Boston, New York, right? Over 40% of the workforce who already works full-time, over full-time, have a second job, right? 30% are housing insecure. Most of them don't have $1,000 in their bank account. Most of them are couch surfing on top of the sort of secondary trauma. So one of the things that, and Fernando, I really appreciate you sharing, this is not a job where you put the phone down and turn down, and if something happens to your participant, it affects you. Secondary traumatic stress. Our colleagues and I, we talked about this, written about this. It's different. There aren't a lot of jobs. Teachers are like this. Social workers can get like this, but you care so much, it actually affects you physically, right? You lose sleep over that. And putting it in context, and also, and Yolanda was mentioning something earlier too, where can we learn? What best practices do we take care of workforces, and how can we adapt them to the unique nature of this work? All of that needs to happen. And how do you get people to care about it? It's just constant narrative change, putting it there, writing it in different ways to different audiences too. Like, I think, again, strategically thinking about how do you write something for this audience versus that audience? Is it on Substack, or, I'm not going to say the name of that social media platform. Let's go with LinkedIn, right? What are the ways you're going to communicate those things? Is it on the radio? In Chicago, there's the Vision 2020 campaign where they're using social media and having contests between different people that are making music, that are making posters, that are making art. The art piece behind me is from the Institute for Nonviolence, from a fundraiser. Everybody comments it when they come in my office at Northwestern, which bridges a conversation. And one of the people actually gave money to them. Right after that conference. It's those little things, and understanding, just like we do in this space, everybody has a different angle. Some people it's art, it's music, it's whatever. How can we have the messaging in those spaces in different ways? That's a great conversation. And all you need to do, again, is go look back to the people that are coming in for lunch to Fernando's office. What are they interested in, right? Chicago Creds making t-shirts and posters, Breakthrough Ministries has a garden, they've got all these different things. And I actually think that's amazing. And it has to kind of help shape and craft the messaging and narrative of the space. And it has to be done in terms of funders as well.
If I could add to your first part of your question, Dallas, about I can't find the question in the chat, but the back of house operations. Obviously, all of us already know that CVI workers are already overworked, and I've seen way too many workers also be responsible for things like writing grants or documentation or these more administrative functions that makes their already cumbersome work even more cumbersome. And so what I would call on everyone to consider is writing those things into your grant applications, like a dedicated budget line item for admin, for a grant writer, for wellness. In Kansas City, they wrote a dedicated line item for wellness initiatives so that it wasn't an afterthought once the inevitable that we all realize that the work is traumatic and all consuming and people need support happens. You already have that written into the budget so you can access those resources and get ahead of it. So I just wanted to name that because in terms of narratives, you can advocate for the fact that that's compromising your capacity, your ability to operate, to do the work that you signed up to do and the work you got the grant to do. And so it's very easy to make the case for why that's necessary. And sometimes we don't always think about putting that specifically into the grant, but I would just remind everyone that that can be written in, and that should be considered part of your operative budget.
Thank you. Okay, we got 5 minutes. I got one more question I think we can get to, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up for the day. And the last one, it's bigger picture, and again, for the entire group. We've talked a lot about innovation and about how excited we are to be looking forward. We've also talked about, right, the need to interrogate not only what is CVI, what is the work, right? But then how do we, what is success, right? How do you balance the two? How do we balance the forward-looking kind of drive, towards innovation with also making sure that we settle on some of these really foundational questions?
I'll come off the mic for a second. I think we need to start by there's not one answer or one question. And I also think we take for granted, and we didn't do this here as much as we usually do, but it's also going to be different in different type of communities, right? The Latino community in Chicago right now is experiencing different things with ICE at its door than its neighbors next door in the Black community, right? And the gang structures are different, the opportunities are different, which also means interventions are different. And so the questions you ask might be different. Also, I think, but at its biggest level, it comes back to something that's in the name, which is, what does community safety look like? Obviously, it's fewer shootings. That's part of it, but that's not all it is. And people listen. again, I'm preaching to the choir here, but if people listen, like community safety and public safety is more than just not getting shot. There's other elements to it. And Yolanda really captured this in a lot of her remarks too, right? Which is, how do we make people feel safe, which is different, by the way, right, necessarily than your idea of getting shot. How do you feel like you're advancing and thriving and not just, not just simply surviving? And what does that mean for the people we're working with and their kids, which is another element? I actually think one really key missing piece that we often forget about is that many of the participants of outreach, they have kids and families. And in fact, that means their kids are experiencing, the trauma of a parent getting shot or incarcerated or dying. And there's an opportunity to really think about systems, families. And again, people are doing this instinctually, part of the work, right? But at the same time, we could be doing more around that. So I think it's really broadening the idea of what we mean by safety, not taking your eyes off of shootings. That's always, everybody's going to think about that, but what else is involved? And again, what did we learn from COVID? Yolanda hit it. We saw it, Dallas, for the work you were doing at the time, all of those things, like that's safety work, fundamentally safety work. It's not going to show up on a crime statistic though. Then it's our job as researchers. So how do we measure that? There's all kinds of ways to measure it. Sociology, political science, history. There are lots of ways and theories that we could do it. We're just kind of been in this very narrow lane. So I think as we're expanding practice, we expand methods, if you will, right, to kind of fit it. And that's what it should do. It should reflect it. It should reflect the world.
Absolutely. Any other last thoughts or comments, Fernando?
There's just the core strategies to CVI. I think we just need to hone in on them. And again, it's defined. It's an identity thing. How do we differ from other movements? And so that's always ensuring that that's strong. You have to, train and support workers. You have to expand the workforce. There's stuff that you constantly have to do. You have to continue to build networks, continue to advocate, continue to shape policy, all of that. But I think the innovation piece is, how are you moving the field forward? I think you constantly have to push. The moment we get stagnant is the moment the movement ends, you stop moving. There always has to be folks that are going to interrogate each other, meaning challenge each other to say, look, we need to do more, challenge our communities to go further and not be complacent with just getting to where we're at. In LA, we were below 300 homicides for 10 years. It spiked during COVID, came back down to below 300. That's still 300 too many. We want to get to vision zero for gang-related homicides in the city. We need to push for that because we deserve it and we can do it, right? And other cities and other communities, the same thing. They're pushing. They have to kind of push to beyond a threshold. Say, look, we got here, okay, but we can get here. And people have to believe in it. And I think once people believe in it, then you can actually achieve it. And so I guess the main piece is when it's innovation, like in this movement, we can never get complacent. We always have to push for innovation, but also we have to know the identity and the core and of what we do and why we do it. Once we lose sight of why we do this work, it becomes something else. It becomes an arm of law enforcement. It becomes social work. It becomes all this other stuff. No, we are not transforming a system. We are building a new system that is based on non-punitive approaches, that is community-led, that values people, that are focused on those that are caught in the cycle of violence and saving lives specifically. That's different than other movements, particularly with the history that our communities have endured for over 500 years in this country.
Couldn't say it any better. I think that's a really tremendous way to end and wrap up. Thank you all. Again, we've come to the end. It's 2:30. Thank you to our panelists again for a really thought-provoking discussion. I've personally enjoyed it. An even bigger thank you to our audience. Thank you all for spending the afternoon with us. Really critical conversation, right, in all of our efforts, whether it's in the street, at the hospital, on campuses, in office buildings, at home, right? They're essential to the field's continued growth. And I know I'm more motivated and optimistic than ever that our collective commitments to safer communities are going to bear some pretty amazing fruit in the years to come. So everyone, please have a great day. Thank you again for joining us. Look out for the recording. They'll be sent around in a follow-up email. Have a great day.